or your voice recorded, I would suggest in the Q&A that you ask your question via chat rather than through audio. But both options are available. So however you want to ask your question, you can ask it that way. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us. I don't know if anyone is joining us from outside Atlanta or from outside UUCA, but we're happy you're here. I don't have a chalice, so I'm going to skip the chalice lighting that we would normally do. Apologize for that. My speaker today, or our guest, is Dr. Jeff Guhin. He's a sociologist who, among other things, studies religion. I would say if there was one primary area to classify him, it would be the sociology of religion, but he does work in a number of other areas. And he's currently at UCLA. He's been there, I believe, about 3 years. Is that right, Jeff?
4.5, so a little bit longer.
4.5, okay. And you can also find some of his shorter, more informal articles on Org Theory, which is a sociology blog. So if you're interested in reading short essays by him, you can find them there. And he has one book out on Christianity and Islam in schools, and he has another book coming out soon. He also teaches sociological theory and the sociology of religion at both the graduate and the undergraduate level. Mm-hmm. So I thought a good place to start would be with sociological classics. If there's one sociological work that a lot of people have heard of, it is The Protestant Ethic by Max Weber. That's a concept that has influenced the way we think about the United States and Europe, permanently changed the way we thought about it. So if you had to name another sociology book that is really perhaps after Weber, that has influenced the way we think about religion, one or two, what would you nominate?
That's such a great question. Well, so there's it's from a larger work, but actually the most important single sociological quote about religion is probably Karl Marx's saying it's opiate of the people, or the opiate of the masses. And so I think it'd be helpful to talk a little bit about that, maybe. And then the other one that is significantly less well known outside of sociology, but has been hugely influential within the study of religion, the self-understanding of religion and sociology, would be what's considered the third major founder of religion, of sociology, Emile Durkheim's, who's a French atheist Jew, and his book was called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. So I'd say those would be the two sort of classic things to refer to. And for Marx, really, it is just a quote that's sort of become the most famous thing. And feel free to sort of cut me off, Chris, and sort of ask a clarifying question, or sort of.
Go ahead with, I mean, I'd love to hear more about the Marx quote. And I mean, I think everyone has heard the quote, but how has it influenced the way we think about religion?
Right, yeah, so there's a few things. First, remember that an opiate, especially at Marx's time, was something that people took because they were in extreme pain, right? It isn't, we might think of, well, especially today in America now, it's actually strangely deeply compelling given the opiate addiction across America right now. But especially in the 50s or other times, people would sort of think of sort of like someone, casually taking heroin to sort of like pass the time and sort of not really think or work hard or stuff. But this is, really in reference, some Marx scholars argue, to opium dens, which would be the places that really destitute, marginalized people would go to just sort of get some relief from working these insane factory jobs that were quite stressful and quite physically straining and physically painful, and would cause all sorts of long-term back and other sorts of problems, right? And so there's a way that even Marx's sense of opiate of the people is related to real pain that people are experiencing and need help with. He just thinks they're going to the wrong place. But the other thing to really emphasize about Marx's thought on religion, and you'll see this in a lot of his other work, especially what's called the early Marx, which is weird because it's basically what Marx wrote when he younger than me now. I'm 40. He wrote all of this really in his 20s and sort of his early 30s.
Right.
And that early Marx was actually discovered much later than the sort of classic Marx, which is like, especially the book Capital. And so Marx is this Christian who is atheist, who was raised a Christian, who was by sort of ethnicity a Jew, who sort of thinks all these complicated things about religion. And one of the things that he thinks about religion is, like Nietzsche, he thinks that religion is this amazing source for creativity, right? And so he regularly is impressed by how much religion has produced. And this is actually something that both Marx and Nietzsche are very impressed by, that like religion makes all this cool stuff, right? Like religion makes Notre Dame Cathedral, religion makes the pyramids, religion makes really complicated and interesting theologies, right? And there are ways that religion is a kind of culture that Marx, and in different ways Nietzsche, find really interesting, right? So even though Nietzsche says God is dead, and Nietzsche himself was not a sociologist, but he was very influential to a lot of contemporary sociologists, especially French sociologists like Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. And so one of the things that Nietzsche's God is dead and Marx's, religion is the opiate of the people sort of miss when you just quote that is the degree to which those are criticisms that come at the end of much longer and more sophisticated and subtle engagements with all the cool stuff religion's done. And what they basically want to say is take all of that energy and put it somewhere else, right? Put it towards something that isn't actually false, right? But like the fact that they think it's false doesn't mean they don't think it's great in a lot of ways, or at least it's produced great things, really admirable things. And then for Durkheim, Durkheim's this really interesting guy who is really, he's not Catholic, but he's very suspicious of Catholicism in a lot of ways, as any Jew in early 20th century France would be. But he is also very, like Marx and Nietzsche, he's very grateful for some of the sort of sociological work religion can do, right? So Durkheim really wants to think hard about how to maintain a sense of community in life. He's very worried, very worried about individualism. And I think like a lot of us today, he sees individualism as a mixed bag, right? I think a lot of us in the West have this experience, right? Like on one hand, he likes that people can do what they want to do. He likes that people can choose a job different from their parents' job. He likes that a baker's son will not necessarily be a baker, and then a baker's daughter can actually do what she wants to do, right? Durkheim was a little bit sexist, but actually a lot sexist, but he still would have wanted a baker's daughter to do what she wants to do. But the point is, like, if you have too much individualism, you run into all these problems, right? You run into very selfish people who don't have a sense of community mindedness, who aren't interested in helping each other, especially helping those who are weaker than them. They just want to take advantage of the system and do what they want to do and just sort of pursue selfish pleasure. But, if you have too much community mindedness or the wrong kind of community mindedness, you can have these very sort of conservative religious or quasi-religious communities which say, no, you can't think for yourself. You have to do what your parents say. You have to do what we've always done. How dare you want to do something else? This is wrong. This is wrong. This is right. This is right. And so how do you find a way that's sort of like between community and individual? And that was sort of one of Durkheim's central, like it was a question that extended across all of his work, right? And, one of the reasons I'm a big Durkheimian is two of the areas he was most interested in, like me, are religion and schools. Like those are the things that he thought were great places to study community. And I think that as well. And so he was really, really interested in how religion and things religion did could help us to create schools and create secular societies that learn from religious techniques to make things more meaningful and to maintain community. So again, it wasn't necessarily about explicitly believing in God. It was about the kind of religious stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this makes sense because, you know, he's a Jew who was then influenced by Catholicism. So he doesn't have this kind of stereotypical Protestant emphasis on belief or not belief, right? It's much more rooted in the ritual and the practice. Obviously, there are Protestants for whom the practice really matters too. But, you know, this is the sort of like old sort of Calvinist versus Catholic distinction, especially. Right. So then in his book, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, he does this interesting thing where he looks at archival data. He doesn't actually ever leave, well, he leaves France for various things, but he never goes to Australia to do this research. But he does research in the French archive of researchers who have been to Australia to look at Aboriginal people and study them. Because he says Aboriginal people are the people with the closest connection to the ancient past. So, you know, everyone else isn't as old, haven't been around for as long, and, you know, might have changed too much or might have been too affected by colonization. But you have these Aboriginal people in Western Australia who are really just kind of, or Northern Australia, who are really just, you know, doing what they've been doing for millennia. So he thinks this is fascinating, right? So we're going to look at what they do and then figure out what religion really is from them. And what he discovers is that for these people, religion is about separating from the sacred and the profane, or separating the sacred from the profane. And it's a little bit tricky because when we say profane, we tend to think profanity, like a bad word. And he gets a little bit into that in the end of the book. But what the book is really about is the sacred as being separated from everything else. So profane for him really just kind of means ordinary, like regular, like we're profane right now, right? There's this sort of sacred thing that's separate from it, right? And the sacred has to be protected. So the protection of the sacred. And then the other thing that is really key for him is practices, is certain rites. And he talks a lot about, I mean, there's a bunch of, it's a very long, really cool book, but he talks a bunch about what he calls collective effervescence. Actually, he doesn't, it's interesting. People think he talks a lot about it. He actually only uses the word a few times. But it's become a kind of key term for him. And he does talk a lot about people coming together. And basically what happens is occasionally we have these moments, which aren't necessarily being in a group, but occasionally we have these moments of kind of a deep emotional resonance where, you know, like suddenly a bunch of, it's like that moment, you know, if you're at a symphony or something, when all the violins are playing and suddenly they're all on the same note, you know, and it's like, and they're all like different notes, and all of a sudden they're kind of, they all get together, right? Or, you know, just like maybe you're drinking a little bit and you're sitting with friends at a dinner table and you just look around and you just feel like really grateful to be there, right? And there's just like 7 or 8 of you, and suddenly it just feels deeply meaningful and in a really profound way. Or you're at a huge concert, right? And you suddenly just feel sort of magically connected to everyone, or a sports game or something.
Yeah. Sometimes
These
people
moments,
use rave concerts.
What's that?
Sometimes people use raves as an example.
Totally. Raves is a great example of concerts. Yeah. And so like, and the concert could also be boring, right? It might not be a moment of collective effervescence, but these moments are moments where it feels like more than the sum of its parts, right? It feels like there's like this huge presence that has come to be among us, right? And Durkheim argues that's actually the source of God, right? That like we essentially confuse the sort of emergent experience of community for God. And the idea of God comes out of, or gods, because it's God's first, comes out of this sort of experience of awe and transcendence of each other, right? So it really has to be community and communal experience that sort of creates the kind of energy that religion allows. And so any kind of social process afterwards needs to sort of keep that in mind and do that kind of thing, right? Which has been used in tons of sociology, including, for example, the sociology of fascism, right? Like one of the reasons that fascism is so effective is because fascism is very Durkheimian, right? Like fascism does a really impressive job of like bringing people together in to do these terrible, atrocious, horrible things. But, you know, they march and they have these kinds of collective experiences, right? And so there's been a lot of social and political movements we might find reprehensible, but that you could understand in this kind of Durkheimian way. So it doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be good collective effervescence, right? The point is just that it's collective effervescence. And it's the sense that we're bigger or smaller than each other.
Right. Yeah, I know that even now when you interview people who join neo-Nazi groups when they're younger, it's because they feel, and they turn completely against it when they're older. Sometimes they feel like it had a unique sense of belonging and merging with a group of people.
Totally. Yeah. It's well designed. I mean, it's a good, I mean, it's really interesting, right? I mean, like there are, and you know, to be less negative about it, right? You could think of like certain activist groups or even like just, you know, generic youth, like kids, church youth groups, right? That do a really great job of sort of making, and it's interesting because they actually do things similar to what Durkheim describes, right? Like sleep deprivation, drugs sometimes. I mean, for us, it's mostly now alcohol, but like it could be like more exotic drugs like peyote or something, right? Like all of these things sort of help you to have these kinds of really intense formative experiences, right? Where like, you know, you've all had 2 hours of sleep and you're giggling with each other and having this like, I love you, no, I love you, no, I love you, know, you're having these like super intense experiences, right? And like, and that does create this sense that it's like, it's more than just us, like this special bond we have. And that's a super interesting thing, right? And this is actually one of the things where sociology is really helpful as sociology, because that is a social phenomenon, right? That's psychologically, we could explain that. I'm sure when that's happening, there are various brain chemicals that are going up or going down. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there are psychological things that are occurring that a good psychologist could help us sociologists understand better. But it is fundamentally a social and sociological process. It is not just one individual relating to one individual. This is a social thing happening.
Yeah, a lot of psychologists now are interested in the phenomenon of awe, experience of awe. I think Jonathan Haidt might have been one of the first people to start to study it. And I think one reason it only started recently was for a long time, psychologists were interested in studying what's wrong with the world. So they were interested in studying mental illness and prejudice and when things go wrong. But some of the newer research does say that awe is this experience of the diminished self and the diminished ego, but in the presence, it's not an unpleasant lack of self-esteem sort of diminished ego. It's a diminished ego in the presence of something much grander than you. And could be, so when you see the Grand Canyon, for example, one of the reasons you have this experience of awe is because of the literal size of it dwarfs any human being. And I don't know if collective effervescence should be translated as awe, because it's not quite the same thing, but it's similar.
Yeah, but it might be a similar psychological mechanism. That's really interesting. I like that a lot. Yeah, so maybe it's a sense of awe at, you know, especially when you think of like, you know, a group of like 50 people or more, where you're just like you're just one part of this really cool, exciting thing. Like, yeah, I can totally see that. It's a similar sort of, that'd be great data. Yeah, I mean, it'd be really, really cool to sort of get that on the psychological level, like what mechanism is actually happening in the brain.
Jumping back to Durkheim, one of the book by Durkheim that I really love is Suicide, which is his analysis of suicide rates and the variations by Catholic versus Protestant versus Jewish countries, which was one of the first, if not the first, major sociological work to rely on statistics, but also just beautifully written. And even if you don't know statistics very well,
Yeah.
it doesn't get in the way. Do you know if those findings hold up in terms of why suicide rates differ?
Yeah, it's a great question. So those of you that don't know, like Durkheim basically did this really cool study of like why suicide happens, right? And previous to this, the sort of argument was always that like, I'm just gonna look this up to cheat because I just want to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting, because I read this book in grad school and I might be getting it wrong. Yeah, so so he defines kind of 4 types of suicides: egoistic suicide, altruistic suicide, anomic suicide, and fatalistic suicide. And then he finds that in general, suicide rates are higher for Protestants than Catholics and Jews. And so basically that like if you have a better sense of being part of a community, of a robust community, like a Catholic or a Jew, and you're less sort of focused on your own individual life, which Durkheim said was Protestants, then you are sort of less likely to kill yourself. So if you're feeling more individualistic, you're more likely to kill yourself, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, contemporary suicide studies, I don't know this field super well. My sense is they don't entirely agree with this. But one thing that has been, so the specific, it's actually very interesting because it's similar to Weber's Protestant ethic. They don't necessarily agree with the overall argument, but they're very, very impressed by the methods and the kind of broader sociological instincts. So let me sort of explain what that means. Do Protestants kill themselves more than Catholics? Maybe, but not necessarily for the reasons Durkheim's saying. But the really important takeaway from Durkheim's study of suicides is that suicides have social causes. And that is a huge contribution to the study of suicide that is still massively important. And so one of the things that people study right now, for example, is suicide contagion. And so it's extremely common in a high school that's had a suicide. The high school then has a much, much, much higher likelihood of having a second suicide than another high school would have. So essentially, a high school has more chances of having 2. I think it might even be the case. I don't know if this is right, but I think I remember reading that a high school might have a higher chance of having 2 suicides than 1 suicide, essentially, because the odds of a second suicide are so much higher than just the odds of a first suicide.
Yeah.
And so there's this problem of suicide contagion is a very real thing, right? And one of the reasons for that is that suicide essentially becomes recognized by students or peer groups as a sort of script, as an available sort of way to solve a problem that other people have sort of recognized and described. So it becomes very important to go in and sort of do education with young people about why suicide is not a good idea, right? And all these sorts of other things. Right. In a similar way for Weber's Protestant ethic, it's actually unclear if Protestantism is what caused, the work ethic to improve. A lot of people have done a lot of work on Catholic Venice, for example, and like other parts of like the northern Italian states, which were Catholic but were very different from southern Italy. But Weber's study of how culture and religion can affect us is hugely important. So my teacher, Phil Gorski, actually wrote a really great book that Protestantism might not have caused the work ethic necessary for capitalism in general, but there's actually a very good case to be made that Protestantism was responsible for the modern state. And the reason for that is that Protestants didn't just have a kind of work ethic, but also especially Calvinists had a very specific kind of self-discipline that allowed them to do the kind of day-to-day bureaucratic paperwork grind. There was literally only paperwork because there were only papers and pens that was necessary for the formation of a sort of early state bureaucracy. And so once you start having actual bureaucracies where you have like forms and like you are like a member of this group or that group, and you're a member of this country or that country, and you pay these taxes or those taxes, right? Like all of that stuff is, hugely complex and actually relatively recent in world history, right? I mean, just like you think of the apparatus of the nation state and just all of the papers involved in that, it's an insane amount of work, right? So to have people willing to just sit in a room and do all of that crap, it was huge. And my advisor Gorski argues that it was actually Calvinism that sort of created the sort of self-discipline necessary to just get people to be bored all day and still do this stuff.
Is there a book by Gorski that you would recommend?
Yeah, it's called The Disciplinary Revolution.
Okay.
Yeah,
I do know that Calvinism has fascinated some anthropologists too, because you can think of Calvinism or the early Calvinist church as an organism and think of it as evolving to preserve itself. Which is interesting. If we jump to the present though, and away from Marx and Durkheim, are there some living sociologists whose work you really admire, like any recent papers you've read that you found really fascinating?
Sure, a bunch, yeah. Gosh, there's a lot. So
I mean, you do the sociology of Islam, so that might be.
Yeah, I do sociology of Islam, and then there's a bunch of those. I do sociology of evangelical Christianity and Catholics too. So, I mean, I can tell you, who's been helpful for me. There's a bit of for this recent book I just published on called Agents of God, which is a study of 2 Sunni Muslim and 2 evangelical Christian high schools. I found that.
And these were in the United States.
They're all in New York City, the New York City area. So I used a few key concepts from different ideas. So there's a sociologist at Notre Dame named Christian Smith, who is just insanely productive. It is infuriating. And he has this really interesting concept called distinction with engagement. There's actually 2 concepts he uses that I really like. And they're actually both in his in a book he wrote called it's actually kind of old now, but I still think helpful, about American evangelicals, and I think it's just called American Evangelicals is the name of the book.
Yeah, he's insanely productive. It's hard to keep track of how many books he's publishing.
Yeah, no, it's got to be over 30 at this point, or at least over 20. So he American Evangelicalism is just the name of the book. So he argues he has a bunch of concepts in this book. It's really interesting, but the 2 that I emphasize in my book, one is this concept of distinction with engagement, which is really interesting. So he talks about how there's some kinds of religious minority groups who just kind of want to avoid the world, like think of Hasidic Jews or the Amish, or even certain kinds of radical leftists who just want to homeschool their kids and sort of live off the grid and things like that.
Right.
And then there's others who really want to join the world as much as possible. So think of certain kinds of mainline Protestants, certain kinds of Reform Jews, for whom the religion is kind of a private affair, but they're really, they're kind of generic Americans, and they don't think of themselves as that different from the secular world. Now, everyone obviously thinks of themselves as different from certain people. So these Reform Jews or mainline Protestants might still very much identify as, very conservative Fox News watchers, or more likely, if they're mainline Protestants and Reform Jews, sort of liberal CNN or MSNBC watchers, and very much think they're not like this other group, right? So it doesn't mean they think they're just like all Americans, but there's a certain group of moderately secular America they more or less identify with, which is different from, a Hasidic Jew or a very, very conservative Catholic, right? This is sort of groups of conservative Catholics who like homeschool their kids, go to Catholic universities, sort of hang out in very Catholic worlds, right? And what's interesting about the American Evangelicals Chris Smith studies and the American Evangelicals I study is they want to kind of be in between that. They want to have what he calls distinction with engagement, where it's really important to them to distinguish themselves from America, right? Like they are not like a lot of these Americans, but they still want to engage it, right? They still want to be part of it and really identify as an element of it. And that distinction with engagements are really, I think, an interesting concept that is useful for a lot of things. And the second thing that Chris Smith talks about is what he calls a sacred umbrella. And this is related to the idea of distinction with engagement. And this gets to another really classic and actually one of my favorite books in the Sociology of Religion by Peter Berger, who recently just died. I really admired him a lot as a scholar. And it's called The Sacred Canopy. And he wrote it in the late 60s. And he wrote it a year after he wrote one of the most important books in contemporary sociology called The Social Construction of Reality. Now he's actually an interesting guy because he was a very serious Christian, but he wrote as what he called a methodological atheist, which is how I write as well, which basically means that God is not a part of your hypothesis, right? That like you, when we're explaining, for example, the rise of Christianity in ancient Rome, we're not going to say because the Holy Spirit guided, right? We're going to say because Christianity appealed to slaves and lower class people, because paganism sort of gave preference to the elites, right?
That's what differentiates from theology.
What's that? Yes, exactly. That will be what differentiates it from theology, and what also differentiates it from some forms of religious studies. Religious studies is a very divided field. So there's most in religious studies now, I'd say, we're more secular, but you could also be like, I guess you would consider yourself now a theologian who maybe does ecclesiology, where you do like church history, and you would do it, but you'd be doing church history like within the instead of like being a secular church historian, you'd be doing church history within the context of theology, and then it would be like the Holy Spirit guided the church to be founded or whatever. You see this tension in Islamic studies as well, and all sorts of places. So anyway, Berger's saying like, look, I'm writing as an atheist. I'm not explaining religion with God as part of the explanation, or the spirit, or anything like that. And so, Berger is really interested in the movement of religion over time. And one of the things that Berger argues is that religion provides what he calls a sacred canopy. And by that he means there's a sort of canopy that protects us from chaos. Because for Berger, the really key point of religion, and this is interesting, this is something quite a few sociologists agree on, the really key point of religion is protection from nihilism. It's protection from, not from suffering, but from meaningless suffering. And so that's a pretty key distinction, right? Like suffering's fine. I mean, it's not fine, but you can deal with suffering. What you can't deal with is suffering that has no meaning to it, that is just there, right? And so like, what religion provides, according to Berger, and also according to a variety of other scholars, is a canopy to protect us from it, right? A sense of meaning and order, where like, this is why the world happens the way it does. And when you don't have that, things get very scary and very frustrating and very weird. And so Berger makes this really interesting point, which I'm not sure is right and is much debated, but he basically has this economic model of religion, where he says that the more choices there are, the scarier the world gets, because the more plausible everything becomes. And you lose what he calls your plausibility structure. So Berger's really interested in these things he calls plausibility structures, which are basically ways the world makes sense to you. And let's say you're, a really serious Muslim, and you're just minding your business, being a serious Muslim, and the world makes sense to you this way. And then you meet this atheist or this Buddhist who seems totally happy and together doing their thing. And you think, well, crap, have I just been doing it wrong the whole time? This person seems like they have their stuff together, right? This person seems like they have their life together. Like what's my deal? And so Berger argues that that's very stressful existentially for people. And so eventually the plausibility structures get kind of messed up, and then they might lose their sacred canopy. And so what Chris Smith does that's really interesting is he says, look, it's actually interesting in America, we have so much religious diversity, and yet people seem to be doing really well with their plausibility structures, right? If anything, all this exposure to difference just makes them more confident. So he says, maybe instead of having sacred canopies, what we have are sacred umbrellas, where we sort of like just carry around these little umbrellas that we maintain through these kind of Durkheimian bonds, right? These kind of Durkheimian connections. And if we lose those Durkheimian connections, we might be in trouble, right? But as long as we have these sorts of communities of people that we trust and that we agree with, even if we run into difference in our day-to-day life, at work, at school, with other friends who aren't in our sort of religious group, we can be like, oh, okay, they might be going to hell. I don't know what's going on. But at least the people who I really love and I care about and I trust affirm what I believe and are committed to what I believe. So I think he's a really interesting sociologist of religion. I like his work a lot. Another person who I think is really interesting is a friend of mine named Christina Simco. Now, she is kind of vaguely a sociologist of religion, but she uses Weber's sociology of religion to think about other questions. And she's doing really interesting work on the nature of suffering. And so, and the term for that, as some of you might know in theology, is theodicy, which is essentially the technical explanation of it in theology, in Christian theology, is why does an all-loving God, who is also all-powerful, allow evil to occur? It's the central question of, for many people, it's the central question of religion. And the Book of Job is, one classical answer. It's a bunch of answers. Mm-hmm. And Simcoe's work is really interesting because she just looks at how different people try to solve that problem differently. So she has a great book that came out 3 or 4 years ago on 9/11 and how just different people around America sort of explain the evil of 9/11 in different ways. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really compelling.
Yeah, for everyone on the call, I should mention Peter Berger, whom you were talking about, also has a really good introductory book to sociology called An Invitation to Sociology.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
One of the most readable books. It does not seem like a textbook at all. No. Just a really enjoyable book. And he also wrote a book about the sociology of humor, or maybe it was just about humor in general, which I think is an undervalued topic.
He is one of the funniest. He's definitely the funniest sociologist I've ever met. He just knew so many great jokes.
I wish I had the chance to meet him. I never did.
I just met him once, but he was extremely charming.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, his books are funny, but Christian Smith, I know Christian Smith as well, and he does. I mean, one of the interesting ideas that I got from him is the idea that young people today subscribe to what he calls moral therapeutic deism.
Right. Yeah. I think it's moralistic therapeutic deism. Yeah.
Moralistic therapeutic deism. Yeah. The idea that God wants us to be nice. They believe in a God who basically wants us to be nice to each other and who may occasionally help us if we pray to him or her. But that's it.
Right. And the God doesn't necessarily do that much in the world, which is hence the deism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a very famous book he wrote called Soul Searching, which is probably his most important book in terms of how it's affected conversation in the world at large, mostly because of this MTD, which has mostly been picked up a lot by conservative Christians as proof the church is going to hell, which is an interesting claim to make. I mean, I will, it's a very compelling argument. So basically, it's extremely well-designed research, right? So they did this nationally representative survey, and then they did random interviews with various people in the survey and just asked them about who God is to them. And they found that even people in sort of more stereotypically conservative, I think the term in religious studies is exclusivist religions, and exclusivist just means that like you really believe your religion is the only correct religion. And so this is true, especially for like Mormons and evangelical Christians and Muslims, right? So they would really say like, I mean, and obviously all of these have complicated debates within them about what their theology is. So I know lots of Muslims who don't think I'm going to hell, right? But like definitely in my field work, like I would have both Muslims and evangelicals I was doing field work with tell me like, I'm really sorry, you'll be in hell. And I'm like, well, thank you. I appreciate your concern, right? And so there is a one Muslim guy, he was like, because you're a Christian, I'm Catholic, and it's like, but I'm a very lefty Catholic, and so the evangelicals didn't think I was close enough to, because I didn't accept Jesus Christ as the only possible savior. I wasn't serious enough to get to heaven. And then because I basically said the fact that I think everyone's going to heaven means I'm not going to heaven, essentially. And then, but the Muslim friend of mine was like, luckily for you, because you're Christian, you will only be in hell to your ankles. And I was like, well, that's nice. Thank you. So, but you know, I have lots of Muslim friends who do not think I'm going to hell, or just might not even believe in an after. Like, there's all sorts of stuff, right? But like, the point though is that, like, for Smith's book, even people in these kind of stereotypically exclusivist religions who tend to have a very like, you're with us or you're screwed theology, wouldn't express it that way in their interviews, right? In their interviews, they'd be much more like, well, I don't know, just everybody has to be nice. Like, and Smith thought this was really interesting and kind of a problem. I mean, Smith comes from this evangelical background where he thought they were kind of being inconsistent to their religion. Now, he's since converted to Catholicism. But, you know, I can say as a Catholic that there's a certain kind of Catholic who's an evangelical convert to Catholicism that brings kind of an evangelical fervor to Catholicism that makes all of us cradle Catholics feel like, whoa, man, slow your roll. So like, but I mean, I like Chris a lot and I like his work. I think one criticism of his work from Catholics that I found especially interesting is that, and he's since written a book about Catholics that is quite good too, just from this group. But Catholics and to some degree and Muslims and basically everyone except evangelical Protestants and maybe, you know, the Calvinist tradition of Protestantism, we emphasize practices and sort of relationships and not speech. But there's a way that if you're a Calvinist in this sort of like very old Calvinist tradition of journaling, and then that translated into the evangelical tradition of proselytizing and sort of sharing your faith and sort of sharing your faith journey with each other. And this could be a Unitarian thing. I'd actually be interested in learning more about that. But like, there is a sort of encouraged practice of talking and becoming articulate. And like any practice, you get better at it by doing it, right? So it's not surprising that, you know, Catholics, Muslims, Jews are actually much more inarticulate than evangelicals about their faith. And it doesn't necessarily mean, that inarticulacy doesn't necessarily mean a lack of seriousness. It could also just mean a lack of practice in constantly articulating your faith and your faith story. Because that's something evangelicals do all the time. Like, they're always sharing their faith story with each other. And so the one criticism of the book that I found interesting or most interesting has been that, and this is a big thing in sociology in general, is that some of the findings might be artifacts of the method, that the interview method confuses articulacy for seriousness, which isn't necessarily always the case.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, he's also done some fascinating work on youth. I think he's written several books on youth, and he's run one panel study where he got one set of young people and followed those people over time.
Yeah,
To
it's the same research study. Yeah, it's
right.
Like Soul Searching is the teenagers one, and then like Souls in Transition, I think, is the sequel, and I think there's a third one as well. They're great. I mean, they're really impressive.
Yeah. For anyone who's interested in why some 17-year-olds don't grow up to be religious 24-year-olds and why some do, those books are quite fascinating.
Yeah, totally.
Well, this would be, I do have other questions I could ask and topics we could talk about, but I think this is a good time to open it to questions. So again, if you join late, one thing I mentioned earlier is we're recording this, and one way to enter questions is through the chat, the Zoom chat. So you could type a question there. You could also unmute yourself or raise your hand in the participants area. And if you're not familiar with the raise hand function, I always get confused with this myself, but I believe you go to, I think I've forgotten now, you go to participants and you right click on your own name. Hildegard, can you help me here?
Let me try it right now. I think it's a reaction.
What?
isn't it?
I don't know the reactions.
So this is Laura Beth. Hi, everyone. If you
Hi.
go to participants and a box will show pop up, and then the lower left-hand corner, it says raise hand, and you just hit the raise hand button. So I'm going to raise my hand right now so you can see.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. It goes away when you're the host, so I couldn't get it to appear.
Oh.
Mm.
That's why I'm not seeing it.
Yeah. Did you have a question, Laura Beth?
I did have a question. I think that it's interesting to hear, going back to some of the conversation around sort of individualism and collectivism and how that is playing such a role in religion right now, especially around the conversations of, white supremacy culture and so, yeah, I don't know. I was just finding the correlation there really interesting. And I don't know that I have any questions about it so much. It's just, I'm just curious to think about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, this is always the problem, right? Is like, there's a lot of people in America who are leftists like me who would love to see a more collectivist orientation, but man, fascists were very good collectivists, right? Like collectivism doesn't happen to the left. So I don't, that doesn't mean we shouldn't move towards collectivism. I think we should, but we just have to be careful about it, right? And also, I do think there's something really important, and I know Chris thinks a lot about this stuff too. There's something really important in having a sort of level of autonomy, because, I mean, there were a lot of original points of liberalism, and there's a lot of ways that liberalism has racism and sexism baked into it. Carol Pateman has a great book called The Sexual Contract about this, and Charles Mills has a great book called The Racial Contract about this. How the kind of social contract tradition all the way back sort of essentially created sort of freedom for white men by sort of assuming Black labor and female labor. And so, there's lots of problems, right? But even Charles Mills, the author of the Racial Contract book, he still would call himself a liberal, right? He still thinks liberalism is important. And one of the reasons liberalism is important, and this is the old idea of liberalism, right? This isn't what we would now think of like liberal as opposed to conservative. This is sort of liberalism in the sense of like, free individuals interacting with each other. One of the reasons that kind of liberalism is important is because, you might think your way of living is the absolute best way to live, but other people might not. And we can just agree to disagree on that rather than just the more powerful of us forcing everyone to live the way we think is the best way to live, because, what if you don't win, right? And so what if the other group winds up having the ability to force you to live a certain way? And so it becomes a really complicated question where the perfect really is the enemy of the good. And the kind of utopianism can be kind of terrifying. Because I mean, this is the thing about ISIS, like ISIS is not evil, right? Like ISIS does evil things, but the way ISIS narrates itself to itself, the way that like the Islamic State thinks of itself isn't like a Bond villain who's like, yes, I have all the power, right? Like they think they're doing God's work. Like they really narrate and understand themselves as doing God's work. Like that is what they have to do, right? And like you can see a very similar thing actually, in like, early, what was it? I think late 16th century England, like in Northern England especially. When Calvinism was really taking off, people were killing priests left and right, and like really just saying like, if you are a Catholic, you are a terrible human being and you will live in this church state, right? And that eventually led obviously to Cromwell sort of declaring kind of like religious dictatorship in England for a fairly brief time. And so, there are lots of ways that, being more collectivist and being more utopian can turn out pretty terrible, right? That's not to say we should give up on utopian visions. That's not to say we should give up on trying to work together to solve problems and trying to be more collectively oriented. I think we should, but I also think these warnings are important, right? That just because we're all together doesn't mean we're all together for something good.
No, I hear you on that. I guess for me, I'm also noticing how the individualist Western culture of, everybody assuming, or at least I shouldn't say everybody assuming, the culture assuming that we're all starting on the same playing field when obviously
Oh, totally.
we're not. Do you know what I mean? And so when it comes to white supremacy, I feel like that is more of a moral issue when it comes to religion. And my parents, who are fundamentalist Christians, would disagree. So I understand that kind of collectivism that you're speaking of as well. And that my parents fully believe they're doing the best, for the world, and in many ways they're doing amazing, wonderful things for the world. And yet the fundamental theology is very, very harmful for the collective.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
So anyway, that's kind of where I was coming from on it, but I hear you on that. I do. I hear.
No, what you're saying is exactly. I just published I didn't publish an article. I submitted an article that I hope is published on conservative Protestants' thoughts on race, and like generally, actually, again, Chris Smith has a great book with Michael Emerson on this about the racial politics of conservative evangelicals. One of the things that he says is most important for them, and we find this in our research as well, is what he calls anti-structuralism. And I would say anti-structuralism is actually a very helpful term that's even better than individualism. Because an anti-structuralism is fundamentally anti-sociological. And what it does is just refuses to see structures, right? And this is to some degree baked. It's not baked into Protestantism, although some people claim it is, but I think that's wrong. But it is baked into American evangelicalism. And so American evangelicalism is really rooted in what they would describe as relationality, and primarily centered on that personal relationship with Jesus. And then all kinds of other relationships extend out of that, right? And in some ways that's lovely, right? In some ways that's very important, right? It's very important to treat people as ends rather than means, to sort of maintain a personal relationship with lots of separate people. That's great, right? But it's also by itself, and I think as an addition to things, it can be really important, right? Like there are very important conservative warnings about like the bureaucratic states, right? Or any large bureaucracy or business that sort of stops caring about individuals and just cares about numbers and things like that, right? But the emphasis on individuals and individual relationships can completely miss, and actually is actively hostile to, structural explanations and even sometimes the existence of structures, right? So the classic example of this, and this comes out of a certain reading of this is like super wonky, but this comes out of a certain reading of actually the Scottish Enlightenment. So the Scottish Enlightenment is most famous for Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but it also had David Hume, it had this guy Francis Hutchinson, it had a bunch of people. And the Scottish Enlightenment really helped to develop in American philosophy in the 1800s, this thing called common sense philosophy, which we never hear about anymore. But it was basically this idea that like life works by these sort of common sense ways of interacting with each other, right? And sort of the world, it was kind of an idiot's version of the invisible hand that Adam Smith talks about, right? That like basically we'll sort of work together and then like we'll sort of set prices naturally by sort of people interacting, right? And there are ways that works, right? There are ways that like, I don't know, bananas are cheaper in America than they were in Cuba, because even though Cuba had bananas, because we let the market set banana prices instead of the state setting banana prices, right? There are ways that like the market's pretty good at that stuff, right? But there are also ways that it's obviously terrible, right? And most economists would say that, right? And this gets to this question of just individuals relating to each other, right? That's the classic idea of both economic and political liberalism. It's just where individuals talking to each other, right? And one of the things that structures like sociology or, lots of philosophy would say is that, yeah, sure, we're individuals relating to each other, but we're individuals relating to each other coming from very different spaces, shaped by different structures and continually shaped by different structures, right?
Right.
And some of those structures include racism and sexism and patriarchy. Some of those structures include various economic systems or cultural systems and all sorts of things, right? And there's a way that a certain kind of American evangelical is, especially a white American evangelical, is deeply hostile to that kind of structuralism, right? Is deeply hostile to the idea that anything outside of an individual explanation is necessary. And that's
Yes.
just a huge problem.
Yeah, so you're naming my members of my family right now.
Yeah, well, I mean,
And it's tough. I mean, it's really tough to have those conversations.
right. Well, because they just don't believe in the structures, right? So if you don't believe in clouds, it's hard to talk about weather, right? Like it's just like, it's like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what it feels like. It's like, okay, well, I can't make you believe in facts. So
Right. Yeah. Right. And so
That's
I mean,
interesting. 'Cause
go ahead.
I was going to say that, I mean, if you look at whether there is such an ideology as conservatism and liberalism around the world, and it gets complicated, but increasingly in large democracies, the idea of conservatism is associated with small government. The idea is that small government is generally good because the government is inefficient.
Right.
It's usually not based on a good analysis of the data. It's quite, I mean, most ideologies are ideological, not necessarily based on data.
Right.
So I think throughout the world now you see a tendency to associate people who think of themselves as conservative, whether it's Hindu conservative or Christian conservative, to also vote for a party that encourages smaller government,
Right.
low taxes, and less redistribution of wealth. So it's not entirely a Christian thing.
Although that's relatively new. I mean, I would like the vast majority, this Marx talks about this, for most of the history of, which is only like 500 years old, right? But for most of the history of sort of popular politics, where like it actually mattered what the masses cared about politics, which is not that long, right? But to the extent that that has mattered, conservatives have usually been very statist, right? Like fascism is much more sort of a piece than sort of American libertarianism. Like if you look at European and other kinds of politics. Now, there's still what we would call either welfare hoarding or welfare provisionalism. So you see this with Trump voters, for example. It's not that they don't want the state to give money. They just want the state to give money to them and not those people, right? Like,
right.
It's not that we don't want a strong state. We want a strong state that can like enforce borders and like do all kinds of stuff. We just don't want the state to help bad people, right? That's huge. I mean, that's like conservatives have been saying that in countries forever. And actually conservatives are saying in America too, that's part of why Trump was popular. It's just for, I don't know, basically since the modern Republican Party, not even that, since like maybe the I wouldn't know an exact date, but my hunch would be the late 1800s, like the Republican Party kind of became the party of big business and really emphasized, and this is before the sort of racial shift. The Republican Party was already the party of big business. The Republican Party really emphasized low taxes and small government, and then managed to convince enough people to go along with it. But most people, I don't think, want small government in and of itself. They just want government to only give them stuff and not people they don't like.
Exactly.
Yeah. But and to be fair, there are some conservatives who are very honest about that in America, including like Trump folks are, and there are some conservatives who still sort of speak out of both sides of their mouth. But to be fair, there's tons of liberals that speak out of both sides of their mouth too, just about different things. But I will say that the anti-structuralism is a really key piece of America that is actually, I think, less true in other countries, although because of just the power of America in the world, it is becoming more true in other countries. So you're seeing it much more in Latin America now than you would have in like 50 years ago.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Right. Oh, I do have one question in the chat, so I'll jump to that, and then maybe we can come back to this. It's a question. I mentioned Chris Smith's work on why, when you follow people from the age of 17 to the age of 24, why some of them start out moderately religious, but then end up claiming no religious affiliation, identifying as agnostic or atheist. And so could you summarize some of Chris Smith's work and whether you think it's valid or there's some alternate explanations for why that happens?
It all seems pretty plausible to me. Basically, It is kind of a Peter Berger argument, right? Like you sort of show up in college and you just meet a lot of smart, interesting people who don't believe in God. And you're like, oh, maybe that's the way that I could live too, right? Like it doesn't have, I guess I don't have to live like this. Like that's a lot of the argument. But the other argument that Smith et al. Are making, which is interesting, is kind of both directions, right? So the one direction is you meet other people and you're sort of convinced by them, but also the stuff you come with is not powerful enough because it's just the sort of generic moralistic therapeutic deism. So you don't really care enough to keep it anyway. So if all you have is like, you know, there's a cosmic waiter who will like help me out when I like ask him for stuff, and he thinks it's cool if I'm nice to people. Then I meet a secular person who doesn't believe in God at all, but is basically the same kind of person. I'm like, oh, I guess I don't need the God stuff, right? But if you have like a rich tradition you really care about that helps you think about the world, then you can keep going. I think the big question for Smith that I'm not convinced by, but he seems to have data to support it. I guess I just don't want it to be true, but it probably is that exclusivism is a big piece of this. So he thinks that the more exclusivist a religion is, the easier it is to keep. And that the less exclusivist a religion is, the easier it is to lose. Which I guess from a purely self-interested perspective makes sense. Like if you believe everyone's going to heaven anyway, or everyone's just dying anyway, and that you personally are Hindu or Muslim or whatever, but there's lots of ways to be a good person, and this is just your way of doing it, then there's less sort of individual incentive for you to keep to your religion than if there really is only one truth, and if you're not right, you're going to hell forever. That seems like a terrible way to live to me, but like it is how a lot of people do live, and they seem to be having happy lives, and so, you know, whatever. But like, and Smith argues that is also a really important mechanism to explain it. And, you know, he's probably right. My sense is, as someone who came up really richly raised in the Jesuit Catholic tradition, is that, you know, I have a way of living and imagining the world that I just couldn't shake if I wanted to, you know? So like, I kind of say sometimes like I don't think I'm an atheist, but I might be an atheist. But even if I were an atheist, I'd be a Catholic atheist. Like there's just no way I couldn't be Catholic, you know? And so like, so I think that's another possible mechanism, but I recognize my experience might be a little more, not necessarily unique, but less important as a mechanism than the kind of exclusivism that Smith is interested in. So look, I don't have other data, right? So unless I really went into his data or did my own study or something to prove him wrong, I couldn't say. But he does lean heavily on exclusivism, which makes me uncomfortable. But it might be just because I don't like the idea that hell motivates human behavior. But I'm sure. I mean, it obviously does. And has for, you know, thousands of years. So, although not that long, Bart Ehrman has a great book I'm almost done reading called A History of Heaven and Hell, about the history of heaven and hell, and it really describes how heaven and hell are really only about 2,000 years old, at least in the Western tradition. That for most of history in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and in Judaism, you just died, or you went to a very boring place that kind of stunk. And this idea of like cosmic reward or cosmic eternal reward or eternal punishment shows up, considering humans have been around for 10,000 years, actually pretty recently.
Yeah, I saw Chris Smith do a presentation of this work at Emory. Emory actually offered him this very prestigious position in the Candler School of Theology, and he almost came here, and then he decided to stay at Notre Dame. But one of the things he found, not surprisingly, is that the seriousness with which parents took their religious obligations, so religious practice overall, was a very good predictor of where children would go. So if you take Catholicism as an example, if you're raised Catholic, I mean, I was raised Catholic, and if your parents take you to church every Sunday and they go to confession however many times a year you're obliged to go, and
Right.
they encourage you to go as well and learn about the sacraments and be confirmed. And so they're really quite serious about it. The odds are higher that you will continue to be a practicing Catholic. However, if your parents are kind of lukewarm and they go to church maybe once a month on a Sunday,
Right.
and they never go to confession, and don't read the Bible, it's likely that you won't maintain that level. You'll fall down further in your religiosity. So later in life, by the age of 24, there's a good chance you'll be an agnostic or atheist. And I mean, he didn't look into this. I think part of that might actually be genetic, or it might not. We don't know. But one reason for similarity between parents and children is usually partly genetic. I think some of it is kind of confounded because he's really good at getting nationally representative samples. And what he finds is Mormons tend to continue being religious, but Mormons are kind of in a unique community because the state of Utah is kind of like a large Mormon community.
Right.
So it's not being
Yeah,
a
but
Mormon.
and even if you're not in Utah, even if you're a Mormon in Brooklyn, there are
Right.
so many mechanisms within the Mormon church to really maintain this kind of Durkheimian solidarity, right? Like
Right.
you like join your Mormon youth groups, you join Mormon, you're required to go to the temple that's just in your neighborhood, right? So it's always within walking distance and always like not always, because there might be very few Mormons around, but generally it's within walking distance, and it's sort of, or very short driving distance, and it's sort of easy to get to, and everybody's very involved, right? And so like, there are all sorts of ways. I mean, basically what you want to do, and this is true as much for making sure your kid is anti-racist as it is for making sure your kid is Christian, is what you want to do is to make sure it seems obvious to your kid. And the way it seems obvious to your kid is because it seems obvious to you, right? And you just couldn't imagine not doing it. And to the degree that it appears optional to you, your kid sort of sees that and recognizes it, even if subconsciously. So this is one of the things that drives me nuts about a lot of, I'm a parent now, and one of the things that drives me nuts about how American individualism seeps into American parenting is parents being like, oh, I would never force my kid to X. And I'm like, that's you bullshit. You force your kids to do all kinds of things, right? You just wouldn't force your kid to like do X thing because you consider X thing optional, which is fine. Like, I don't care, right? Like, if you don't want to force your kid to go to church, you don't want to force your kid to have a religion, sure. I mean, whatever, you do you, right? Like, I don't think that's going to affect anybody's afterlife or anything. It doesn't really bother me. But like, I'm definitely going to force my kid to be anti-racist. Like, I'm not going to be like, well, let's have a conversation about it. And if you decide you want to be a Nazi, I'm going to affirm your choices, right? Like, that's not going to be a conversation we're going to have, right? And so like, this idea that like, I think people, especially Americans, don't recognize the degree to which we coerce what we take for granted. And they sort of assume that they're only, because it seems so obvious to do it anyway, we don't narrate it as coercion. We narrate it as just what we would do, right? But it actually is coercion. Like, it's forcing your kid to be certain things. And that's okay. Force is a natural part of life, right? Force happens all the time. And so one of the things that I think sociology helps us with, but it makes Americans very uncomfortable, is thinking about the role of power in lots of kinds of interactions where Americans are deeply uncomfortable with power, right? It shows up all over the place, but they would rather not think about it. And they'd rather think, again, this classic liberalism, right? They'd rather think of every interaction as kind of a free interaction of ideas and a free exchange, right? So the fact that there's a male, I have more power. In fact, there's a straight person or a white person, I have more power. All of these things people would rather not examine. And they'd rather just think, oh, we're just talking, right? And so even when you get to parenting, which is like the ultimate example of an unequal relationship, there's still a lot of people who are really uncomfortable with the inequality of that, right? And it's super interesting. And I think ultimately they wind up being fine parents anyway, but it's just the way they narrate it is often quite distinct from the way they do it, which I think is actually just fascinating sociologically.
Yeah. I mean, one factor right now too is I think you associate people who are high in, well, when you think of people who are high in religiosity, and who force their children, so to speak, to be religious, you think of evangelicals,
right,
and fundamentalists. So if you define yourself as definitely not a fundamentalist, like part of your identity is, I'm definitely not a fundamentalist, you may then think that part of doing that, part of enacting opposition to fundamentalism is not forcing your child to take your religion very seriously and saying, my child should be able to make their own choices. And that could be, that's a speculation. I don't know if there's interview data to back this up.
I mean, Muslims and Catholics and Jews, they have an interesting way of kind of cutting the middle, right? Where they would say something like, you have to do X, Y, and Z, but if you want to be more intense with A, B, and C, that's up to you, right? So for Muslims, like, you have to fast during Ramadan, but if you want to fast every Tuesday, which is like another thing Muslims do, more devout Muslims do, but it's not required, it's just considered, there's an Arabic term for it, it's like recommended, then you could do it, right? And you can do it with me or whatever. And like for Catholics, right? If you want to not just fast during Lent, which happy Mardi Gras, everybody, then you could also fast on Fridays, which a lot of more devout Catholics do, right? And so there's sorts of ways to go like to up it a level, right? And one of the problems for Protestants, especially evangelicals, is they don't really believe in what the historian of religion and philosopher of religion Charles Taylor calls a religion on two tracks. So one of the really brilliant innovations of Catholicism, although deeply problematic but brilliant, is that it just doesn't expect much of people. Like it just thinks people are basically pretty dumb and not really that capable. And so essentially, as long as you get the Eucharist and go to confession once a year, it'd be great if you went more. That's cool, right? And even the priests, they think are pretty dumb, which is why they give priests the same kind of set things to say, right? And like, look, that can be terrible, right? Like that can like lead to all kinds of anti-democratic things. There's a reason fascism does so well in Catholic countries. It can lead to all kinds of really alienating experiences of religion. There's a reason Catholic masses are often so boring and Catholic prayers are often so bad. But it's kind of idiot proof, right? It kind of like lets people go on two tracks. So if you want to be an intense Catholic, you can pray a ton more, you can do all this stuff, you can maybe be a monk or a nun or a priest. But if you want to just kind of flow, you can just kind of flow, because the Catholic Church thinks people are basically pretty dumb and not that capable, right? And the major radical thing of Protestantism, which is why Protestantism is very involved in the Western development of democracy, is it says actually anybody can do this, which in some ways is amazing, right? In some ways is really great. I'm really grateful for it. But it also then makes it really hard to be a Protestant and to be a Protestant like your parents, right? Because you're either in or you're out, right? You're either like committed to the same level as the preacher, or you're a bad Protestant. So there's not this mechanism to be kind of a lukewarm, especially evangelical. There's really not this mechanism to be a lukewarm evangelical. Whereas there's tons of mechanisms to be a lukewarm Jew, a lukewarm Catholic, a lukewarm Muslim. And so like, that's also a sort of interesting part of the socialization story.
Does anyone else have questions?
I think Patrick.
Did you say there's a Patrick here?
Yes,
Yeah,
Patrick.
Patrick, yeah.
The question I have is probably more current about the last 4 years.
Sure.
And the making up of truth is what it looked like. And,
yeah.
And yet, so many people buying into it. I wondered what your thought was about all those years, because it was very disheartening for me to hear so many people taking it in and thinking of it as the way it is.
Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. There's a few pieces here, right? So one, I would say that, vaccine denial, creationism, denying that Trump lost the vote. These are magnified and made much worse by the media ecosystem we have now, especially social media and things like Fox News, and then stuff much further to the right of Fox News.
Uh,
And for that matter, sometimes MSNBC and CNN. Like I think MSNBC, my wife watches MSNBC all the time. I think it's fine, but I think they over sensationalize the Russia investigation in a variety of ways. Don't get me wrong. I think Russia totally helped Trump win the election, and they should have been impeached for it. But sort of every single day was this drama, right? And so it wasn't like, I think it sort of shifted from journalism to entertainment in a certain kind of way. I don't think that's comparing apples and apples. I think like that's sort of annoying, and what sort of, not necessarily the Fox daytime people, but the Fox evening people did is like actual malfeasance. So I don't think it's symmetrical, but I do think there's a kind of infotainment of news on left and right. But I will say that the fact of social media and the fact of news makes this a significantly worse problem. But I think you would have had, if those things existed at any other moment in American history, except maybe 1945 to 1970s. No, whenever the fairness doctrine was gotten rid of, like you would have had the same thing. You definitely would have had the same thing in the early 1900s. You definitely would have had the same thing throughout the 1800s. You definitely would have had the same thing in the late 1700s. This is a new American situation because of our media ecosphere and because of social media, but it's not a new American problem at all, like just at all. And so like one of the primary reasons American evangelicalism became what it is was because of a deep-seated suspicion of East Coast elite preachers and East Coast elites in general. And it's exactly the same as today, right? These sorts of fancy elites who think they know more than me, right? And there's a great book by Nathan Hatch called The Democratization of American Christianity. And in it, he describes how this sort of development of American evangelicalism and the kind of anti-intellectualism, or if not anti-intellectualism, then anti-expertise of, which isn't quite the same thing, of American evangelicalism, comes out of actually a much broader tradition, right? And so there was a very similar suspicion of lawyers. There was a very similar suspicion of doctors, of politicians, of anyone who calls themselves an expert. And so you had like, there's actually a great book by a Princeton sociologist named Paul Starr about the history of medicine in America. And you see a very similar story where like, for most of the, early and mid 1800s, you have just like dudes going around in wagons, like literally selling snake oil, right? These are snake oil salesmen.
Right.
Saying like, I'm gonna heal everything, right? And just like, trust me, right? I'll help you out. And imagine if those guys had Facebook, right? Imagine if they had Twitter, right? Imagine if they could get on Hannity. And so like, it's a different media world now, but this is not a new American problem. Like don't get me wrong, I'm very cynical and depressed about it, but the problem, the big problem that we have to solve is the technological piece, because this has been an instinct we've had forever, just forever. We have, in America, this gets back to what I was saying about power. In America, we're just very, who are you to tell me you can solve, my kid's polio? I met this guy yesterday and he told me that if, I take my kid on 3 walks a day and, brush his teeth right or whatever, then he'll get better, right? And he's not some fancy Harvard person coming here telling me how to heal my kid. Like those things have existed all of American history. So like it's suspicion of elites, resentment of elites, and that's like, I think it's even stronger now for a variety of reasons. I think it's tied into race in a way that it's always been, but it's more explicit now, in gender. But like, it's there's a reason Trump likes Andrew Jackson so much, right? Like it's a kind of Jacksonian democracy that we've been dealing with forever. Not forever, but at least since the beginning of this country.
I have a follow-up question on that. I've been listening to a lecture by he's not a sociologist, but he's actually a minister out of the evangelical movement, but he now considers himself a part of the post modern Christianity, or I
Okay.
think another word for it, a couple of other words for it. And his name's Brian McLaren, and I'm just fascinated by the talk. A friend of mine who is a Christian sent it to me, and it's called Post-Trump Christianity.
Oh, interesting.
Just wondered he makes a point in there. Well, he makes several really amazing points to me, but one of them is Christianity has to embrace its role in this, and one of the reasons is the type of Christianity that doesn't allow doubt and doesn't allow questioning raises people who follow authoritarian leaders.
Sure.
Who are,
Sure.
and also that people are okay with, or love being Christian supremacists. They may be embarrassed to say they're white supremacists, but they're clearly comfortable with a Christian supremacy.
Mhm.
You know, this is a Christian country kind of thing. And I just, I know that there are other religions too that foster authoritarian leaders. I mean, in the Muslim world, that we've seen that, but his other point is that if people who are the doubters leave completely, and you may think that it's okay to go to no religion, but he said that you have to be careful with that they're open. Some people are open then to forming their identity around, conspiracy theories, or attaching themselves to some other philosophy that's, is crazier. So I'm wondering if what your thoughts are in terms of the sociology of Christianity at this point in history in the U.S.
Wow, that's such a great big question. Yeah. It's complicated, I mean, because one of the things you're really asking, it seems like one of the things you're asking about is what's the future of white conservative Christianity, which is a very specific kind of thing. And there's a lot of hard questions they've got to ask, and a lot of them are afraid to ask them. And so, I really don't know. I certainly have friends who study this stuff exclusively, and they're concerned about it. There is a tremendous amount of diversity. I will say younger people who are more serious about their religion tend to be more embarrassed by Trump and Trumpism than older people. So you do see some divisions along age lines, but I don't think there's this really important thing that sociologists often say, which is demography isn't destiny, right? Like, just because old people vote a certain way and young people don't vote a certain way, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way, right? That doesn't mean that everyone who believes X is just going to die off and then we'll be fine. That's not necessarily true, right? People can change in all sorts of ways throughout the life course or through various events. And so I think that one of the central challenges for white conservative Christian evangelicals is going to be learning how to think about being a minority in a way that is truly a minority. And one of the challenges for them is they've been narrating themselves. Oh, thank you very much. They've been narrating themselves as a minority since the beginning of their founding, or the 1850s, because in some ways they kind of always narrated themselves as this kind of ugly, Baptist and Methodist and stuff, narrated themselves as the kind of ugly stepbrothers of the sort of fancy mainline Protestant religions in the East. And now, even if a quarter of America is conservative Christian, conservative evangelical Christian, they still say, well, that's just a quarter, the rest of America is against us, blah, blah, blah. But for a while, a lot of Americans basically agreed with conservative Christians about a lot of stuff. And they never really recognized how much, it's like anything, right? Like, if you have a sister or a brother, you fight with them all the time about all the things you disagree with them about. And then when later on you disagree about even more, you're like, oh, actually we agreed about a lot, right? Or that old joke that I want to be as skinny as I was when I first thought I was fat, right? Like this sort of idea that like you never really see how much or how little you have until later, right? And so that evangelicals sort of have always sort of positioned themselves as in a battle to save America's soul, right? But over time, they keep losing more and more of a piece of that. And it's finally, really probably after the Supreme Court decision to defend gay marriage, that's really when a lot of white conservative Christians sort of came together and said, crap, it's actually true. Like we really are losing America. And there just became a very different posture. And so one of the things that's interesting is conservative Christians for a very long time were very opposed to talk of pluralism, like very opposed to pluralism. America just had to be a Christian country. And now that so many people in power are secular, there's actually much more talk among conservative Christians about pluralism, about respecting multiple viewpoints and different points of view. And quite a few people who actually are committed to pluralism are pretty mad about it because they think, you know, where were you 20 years ago, right? When you were insisting everyone had to be Christian. Which doesn't mean that you shouldn't necessarily like, you know, or whatever. If someone was wrong for a long time and now they're right, it doesn't mean they're not right, right? But like it is a complicated, weird thing, right? And sometimes they still seem like they want pluralism with strings. But you know, thinking more and more about what pluralism for conservative Christians would look like and mean is an interesting question, right? And I think it's an interesting political and sociological and ethical question. So thinking about things like, you know, the classic example is obviously gay wedding cakes, which, you know, actually affects maybe like 25 people a year, but you wouldn't know that from the way American evangelicals talk about it, you know. And so because this is an important symbol, and I get that it's an important symbol, right? Like I understand that it's an important and meaningful symbol for people. And like, yeah, I mean, it's just that's going to be where the rubber continues to hit the road. That and Trump. I mean, the big thing is like the degree to which people want Trump to be the continued sort of pagan defender of Christians, which is how he's often narrated. And who knows? I mean, I just don't know how that's going to play out, but I think those are going to be the two big things.
So I think we're going to need to end our session here because it's 9 o'clock. So thank you again for joining us. It's been great having you here to talk about a range of issues.
Sure. Yeah.
As a sociologist myself, I mean, apart from Christian Smith, whom I personally know as well, I don't read much about the social religion. And so it's fascinating to hear
Thank you.
about some of the work that's being done there. Next week on Tuesday, we'll have an interfaith panel. So we'll have ministers or clerics from a Muslim mosque, a Sikh Gurdwara, a Jewish temple, a Buddhist temple, and the Catholic Church, most of whom are from the Interfaith Atlanta Faith Alliance.
Oh, great.
And the day after that, on Wednesday, we'll have part 1 of empathy training for tough times, what to say when you don't know what to say, led by Reverend Strauss, our minister, and co-facilitated by some of our lay ministers. So we have something on Tuesday and we have something on Wednesday. And as with all our sessions, they will be over Zoom. So thank you again for attending. I do not have a chalice, so I will not be extinguishing a chalice. I need to put that on my list of things to purchase. And good night.
Well, thanks so much for having me, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank
very
you,
much.
Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank
Of
you
course.
very
Thank you very
much.
much.
Very interesting.
Appreciate it.